welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. We're continuing our series looking at the Gospel of Luke, and we're in chapter 8 this evening. A lot of Luke's chapters are pretty long, and so there's a lot to cover in this one, so we'll kind of go through it bit by bit, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. As usual, as we normally do, we'll kind of look at how Jesus specifically fits into his historical context. So what does Jesus's behavior and things mean in his own day and age? What does it mean to the people around him? How would he have been perceived politically and socially, as opposed to simply pulling out the things that he says and does and applying them straight away to our lives? We're looking at it specifically in its history. And so in chapter 7, we had a fair amount of looking at some different stories of healing and the messengers from John the Baptist, who Jesus' role is as the Messiah and as God. And so now we're going to continue on. Luke is going to give us sort of stitched together a few vignettes and a few bits of Jesus's teaching, all kind of stuck together in a sort of thematic way. And one of the main themes of this is the way that Jesus interacts with and welcomes women into his ministry. It was not common in his day and age to treat women as equals. And as we look back on so much of the Old Testament and the New Testament as well, we can see how, as much as Jesus is really revolutionary in his treatment of women, the New Testament is still really far behind in terms of equality, in terms of the misogyny that still exists in the day, because the people who are writing it are still living in that time. They're still products of their time. And so while Jesus' message and Jesus' treatment of women is revolutionary and is still furthering the idea of equality that needs to be grasped, it's still not all the way there, especially in the rest of the New Testament and the early church. But we'll see how Jesus subverts expectations. So we'll start off in chapter 8. I'll read a little bit here. Soon afterwards, he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and remember we had that little discussion of lowercase d disciples and uppercase D disciples, the 12 and the apostles and Judas and Matthias and Paul and all of that. So the 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources. Now, it was common in that day and age for men to maybe travel around, but for women to stay put in their home and for them to take care of traveling preachers and teachers and things like that. So people like Jesus and his contemporaries might have traveled around with a group of men, but they would have stopped in different places and there would have been women there to care for them. And we see that is true for Jesus as well, that there are women in certain places who do look after him when he stops there. And that was seen as more of what their role would be. But what we have here recorded by Luke is that not only were there women who were in certain places, staying in their homes, and when Jesus would come to them, they would take care of him, but they're also traveling with him. And that is very, very revolutionary. Co-ed teaching was not a thing in the ancient world. It didn't happen in Jewish culture or Greek culture. It certainly didn't happen in terms of the traveling itinerant preacher thing. There was no record of any other Jewish teacher around the time having women who traveled with him. So for Jesus to have women travel with him, and not just women, but women like Mary, who had 7 demons cast out of her. In some tradition, it says as well that she had been a sex worker. You have Joanna, you have Susanna, and many others. They're actually named. It's not just women. These are 3 women who are named. This would have been scandalous, and his opponents would have tried to use that against him. But it's revolutionary of him, and he lets them come along as part of his disciples. I say lets, that's the phrase. He is treating them as equals, as they should be treated. And that would have been very different for the time. The next section we get is the parable of the sower, which is a really famous parable that we get in the New Testament about the sower went out to sow his seed, and they cast the seed everywhere. And it was common to sow the seed before the plowing of the fields. And so you kind of go out and cast it, and it would happen like this. And these sort of farming agrarian metaphors would have been well understood by the people he's speaking to. But what was uncommon is for Jesus to tell parables as a way to kind of confound people, to make it so only people with ears to hear, as he says, can understand them. Other rabbis told parables to illustrate and to increase understanding, but Jesus does it almost to confound people. There's some kind of record of some Greek philosophers doing this in order to keep outsiders away, but for the most part, parables were a tool of illustration, not a tool of confounding. But that's how Jesus uses them. And this one is almost more of an allegory, but he also then explains it, which he does not do for every parable. And so that's an interesting little bit there. And then he talks about hiding a lamp under a jar and listening and having, again, that ears to hear sort of thing. And that's probably stitched on to the end of the sower of the parable. And then we have the story of Jesus' mother and his brothers coming to him, but they could not reach him because of the crowd. And reading here in verse 20. And he was told, "Your mother and your brothers are standing outside wanting to see you." But he said to them, my mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and do it. And now in the story, and we've got others in other gospels as well that are similar, it doesn't say that he refuses to see them or he doesn't, eventually go out and speak to them, or he's not spurning his family necessarily. And we know that Jesus always did take care of his mother, even to the point where he is on the cross and his mother is there, and he says to John, the beloved disciple, to please take care of Mary. So we know that he's not estranged from his family. It's not like he's here advocating complete removal of the family. But it was revolutionary of him to suggest that family is not the highest thing that you can have in your life. I mean, students could revere a teacher as a father, and there was an idea of caring for people in your community as if they were family. But to say that family essentially is a constructed idea and that the people around me are my family was very different for his day. And of course, that's an idea that we really take seriously in our modern age as we begin to realize that although we might be related to people by blood, those people might not be the best people for us. They might not treat us very well. They might even be abusive. And sometimes it is actually best for us to distance ourselves from family and have more of a kind of chosen family, people around us who do care for us and treat us well. And that this idea that blood is thicker than water can often be used to prop up abusive and toxic relationships and keep people kind of trapped. We should obviously love and respect those who love us, and those who are our family mean a lot to us. But I think part of what Jesus is saying here is that we cannot be tied to just the idea of blood relation over and above the gospel in good sense, or even loving and being loved well. The next story is another one that is known from other gospels. It's when Jesus calms the storm. He's been doing a lot. He's been going and going and going, and he gets in a boat, and they go to cross over to the other side of the lake. Now, this is going from the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee over to the Gentile side on the east side. And it's quite common on the Sea of Galilee, just the way it's located geographically, for storms to rise up pretty quickly. And the fishermen, who they are as the disciples, would have known this, but they often stay closer to the shore on their own side. And so they're crossing the lake and they get caught in a storm. And Jesus is sleeping somehow. So either he's just absolutely exhausted or just really belligerent. But in any case, he's sleeping in the boat. And they wake him up and they're frightened. Obviously, it's a big storm. It's not a very big boat. If you've ever seen pictures of some of the boats that they've uncovered from the Sea of Galilee, archaeological finds that are of the time, they're just basic boats. They're not big. They don't have bits underneath that Jesus can go down. It's not like he can go down into a room underneath and the storm's happening outside and he's kind of in a quiet room. It's just an open boat, and so he can maybe be sleeping up on a platform in the back that's kind of out of the water that would be in the bottom of the boat. So it's really unlikely that he's staying asleep here. But they go and they're terrified and they wake him up. And he says, "Where is your faith?" And then he calms the storm. And they're amazed and they're frightened because he's just controlled the weather. And that was something only God could do. In all of the Old Testament, only God controls the weather. There were some righteous people who prayed for rain, and rain might come, but that was because God caused the rain to come. They did not control the weather in this way. Only God could do that. God, as creator, is the one who controls the wind and the waves and all of that. And so for Jesus to just speak a word and calm this storm, and again, these are fishermen, they would have been in many, many storms on the Sea of Galilee in their life. And for him to just do that, it amazes them, and they are afraid, because that is a powerful, prescient moment of going, whoa, who is this? This is not just some rabbi. This is not just some teacher. He just told the weather what to do. And you can almost feel their trembling. So again, this question of identity in the miracles of Jesus, it's not just, oh, cool, he can control the weather. Jesus, why don't you control the weather? Why don't you stop the hurricane that's just hit New York? Or why don't you stop climate change? It's not about that. It's about Jesus presenting his identity as God. And then they reach the other side, and they reach what Luke describes as the country of the Gerasenes. In Matthew, you have Gadara, or the Gadarene area, and some people call the story of the Gadarene demoniac. Gadara and Gerasa were two towns on the other side, on the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee, a few miles apart. So in the same region, Gerasa was the bigger of the city, so it might have been more well known, because I think Mark actually says the same. But they're kind of the same area. They're just that area on the other side, in the area of the Decapolis, in the Gentile side. And here we have, again, another pretty famous story of a man who is possessed with so many demons that the demons describe themselves as Legion. They name themselves Legion. And he has been imprisoned, he's kept under guard, he's been chained, but the demons give him so much strength and power that he breaks out, he's violent, he goes out into the wild, he harms himself, he does all sorts of really wild things. And so he's out there in the wilderness, and Jesus orders the legion of demons to leave him. And now we have a bit of strange bargaining with the demons, which in sort of ancient lore was pretty common for demons when they know they're beat to kind of begin bargaining. And they say, don't send us into the abyss, or don't kill us. There's some thought in the ancient world that demons actually could be killed. And they say there's a herd of pigs, cast us into the pigs. Pigs, again, of course, completely unclean. No Jewish person would be keeping pigs, but they're on the Gentile side. And so Jesus casts out the demons, and they go into the pigs, and the pigs all go into the lake and drown. And this is a really strange story, and I never quite know what to do with this, because on the one hand, you're like, oh, great, Jesus drove out the demons from the sky, great for this guy. And then you kind of think, but what about the pig herders who now just had their entire livelihood decimated? We often talk about Jesus doing things for people that doesn't just help them physically, but helps them socially and economically, like the widow we had earlier who was burying her only son, and Jesus raises him from the dead. It's not just that she's mourning the loss of a son and a family member, but she is a widow and now alone. She has no means of support. She has no way to take care of herself. And so Jesus' raising of her son doesn't just bring a family member back, but protects her socially. And here, Jesus drives these pigs, Jesus doesn't drive them, but he drives the demons into the pigs. And I don't really know what to do with all of that. The people are amazed around the area, but they also are kind of like, okay, thanks, but no thanks kind of go away in that sort of way of the movie The Incredibles, where you have that kind of confrontation of the collateral damage of the superheroes. And Mr. Incredible is running around and he's saving people and he's stopping the bad guy, but in the process he's destroyed people's cars and he's bashed out people's windows and he's destroyed their homes, but he stopped the bad guy. Great, thanks, Mr. Incredible, but you also jumped on my car and smashed it. I don't have cover for superhero. So it almost it feels a little bit like that. And maybe digging into that is something for another day. But anyway, he tells the man who wants to come with Jesus back to the Jewish side, no, you stay here and tell people about what I've done. Now they return to the other side, back to the Jewish side, and there's massive crowds there. And then there's a guy called Jairus, who's the leader of the synagogue, and this could be just a upstanding citizen, but likely it's a wealthy person who's been probably the largest donor in the town to the synagogue. So he's the leader of the synagogue because he's got the deep pockets and he keeps it running. But he also could have been respected as a good man. He comes and falls at Jesus' feet and says, please come to me. I have a daughter who's dying. And this is the story that always brings to my mind the story we had earlier of the centurion who sends for Jesus and says, I want you to heal my servant, but like, you don't even have to come because like, I know that's not okay, but like, just say the word and it'll be healed. And so now here we have a Jewish guy rather than a centurion, and he comes himself and says, Jesus, please come. Jesus starts going, and on the way we have nested in this other very famous story of the woman who has the issue of blood. And what this, in all likelihood, means is she never stops her menstrual bleeding. And so not only would that be incredibly uncomfortable and just downright painful and terrible to deal with in terms of that continual loss of blood, I can't imagine how she feels physically, just drained and depleted and awful and probably actually unclean, not just ceremonially unclean, but she's probably not at all feeling good. And this has been 12 years that she's dealt with this. And it's a massive crowd. And because of the issue of blood, not only is that physically obviously terrible, but it is makes her ceremonially unclean. And so whether or not she was married before, she's likely divorced at this point. She can't go around people because even going around people makes them unclean. She can't go to the temple or to the synagogue. She can't do basically anything. So she would be almost a complete outcast at this point. So even for her to be in the crowd is technically, by their rules, wrong of her, because she's basically making everyone around her unclean. But she goes and touches Jesus, and that again would have made Jesus unclean. But instead of making him unclean, she's healed. And Jesus feels the power going out of him and says, someone touched me. And Peter goes, Jesus, you're in a massive crowd. Everyone's touching you. But Jesus knows it's something different. And then he sees her and speaks to her and acknowledges her. And she knows she can't stay hidden. She comes trembling, falls down before him, and she said, it was me, I touched you, but have been healed. And he says to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. So he doesn't chastise her. He doesn't get mad. He doesn't even say you need to go do any ritual cleanliness. He doesn't even say, well, now I'm unclean. He says, your faith has made you well. But then while that's happening, someone comes from Jairus' house to say that the daughter has died. But Jesus says, oh, don't worry, let's go anywhere. And you can tell that they don't necessarily think Jesus can bring her back from the dead, even though we've seen him do that before. It doesn't seem like they think that. They think that Jesus can maybe come and heal her before she dies, but when she's dead, maybe not. But he says, let's go anyway. And he comes in and says, she's not dead, but sleeping. They know she's dead. They know when someone's dead. And they laughed at him. But he goes in and takes her by the hand and says, child, get up. And Mark records an Aramaic phrase that Jesus says, where he says, Talitha kumi, which means basically the same thing, child, get up. And Mark gives a translation of it in Greek that uses a different word than Luke uses here for child, but it essentially means little girl. Child, get up. And her spirit returns, she gets up. And they were astounded, but he orders them not to tell anyone. Back to that kind of secret identity thing, keep this under wraps, even though he just told the Gerasene demoniac to go tell everyone on the Gentile side. But that phrase, Talitha cum, it sets us up for Luke. Later in Acts, Peter heals Dorcas, who's also known as Tabitha, and he raises her up and he says to her, Tabitha, get up. And so it's almost almost an identical phrase, Tabitha, get up, and Talitha cum is sort of linguistically linked there. Of course, Luke and Acts written both by Luke. But back to the woman and the bleeding, again, this theme of the women that Jesus treats as equals and does not cast out. He does not set up barriers, he breaks them down. And even for this woman who in her society would have been the lowest of the low as a woman and as someone who's perpetually unclean with this medical issue, he does not take any issue with her, and he welcomes her and calls her daughter. So again, that theme of equality, and especially gender equality there for Jesus throughout this whole chapter. Thanks for bearing with us here as we go through all of Luke chapter 8. Thanks for joining us. I hope you have a good week, and join us next week as we'll continue on with Luke chapter 9. Thanks, everyone. Good night.